$60 billion US. That is the amount that China is pledging towards African development and infrastructure. And it was announced during Chinese President Xi Jinping's address in Beijing here today. He spoke to the leaders from more than 50 African countries who are in China for the opening of the Forum on China-African Cooperation. Now, this event is much lauded here in China. It's seen as a celebration of China's leadership in a globalized world, and also a statement that China is open for business at a time when many other countries are not. But at the same time, this forum is not without its controversy. Many analysts, particularly in the US, have accused China of using this event to suck some African countries into some sort of debt trap. And some have even gone so far as to call this an example of neo-colonialism. But Chinese state media, as well as Chinese President Xi Jinping himself, have been very keen to combat these criticisms, saying that no, that's not what this is about. This is not a so-called Chinese vanity project. This is indeed a way to common prosperity.
China will always be a good friend, a good partner, and a good brother of Africa. No one can destroy the great unity of the Chinese and African peoples.
In particular, through getting more African states involved in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is really an ambitious plan to connect Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, and now Africa by sea and land. And to emphasize this win-win cooperation, President Xi Jinping also announced that they would be boosting imports from Africa. He also announced that some African countries would be exempt from some of the debts that were due to China by the end of 2018. Now, this figure of $60 billion US, some may not be too pleased with it because it's exactly the same amount that was pledged by China during the last forum in 2015. But this year, what's different is that many African leaders are now focusing not just on quantity, but on quality. They want to know that they're getting the best bang for their buck from these investments. And how exactly they're going to do that? Well, that will be discussed as the forum continues in Beijing tomorrow.
And for more on China's economic ties with Africa, let's bring in Joachim Klement from London. He's the head of investment research at financial advisory firm Fidante Capital. Joachim, great to have you on Money Talks. China's trade with Africa has grown exponentially over the last 2 decades. Who has benefited the most out of this? Have both sides benefited equally, or has one side benefited more than the other?
I think in the beginning, the African countries have probably benefited more. Exports from Africa to China have grown by about 53% between 2006 and 2016, and another 14% in 2017. In other words, China is now about to become the second biggest export market after the EU for the African continent, and that it definitely is a boon for African countries. What is interesting about that is that while in the past China has very much focused on African exports of commodities to China, it is now focusing more and more on helping to provide financing for projects that help create a consumer base in Africa and to help Africa's economy to export more than just commodities. In a sense, to me, this is like the Marshall Plan that the Americans had in Europe in place after the Second World War to rebuild that entire continent and to basically create a consumer base that will, after a while, start to consume, in this case, Chinese exports and Chinese products.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the Marshall Plan because a lot of comparisons have been drawn between One Belt, One Road and the Marshall Plan. But a crucial difference, to my mind, between the two is that the Marshall Plan essentially gave money to a lot of countries in Europe, as opposed to lending money. And that is what Beijing is doing. And that is what's the accusation against Beijing right now, that it's trapping a lot of these poorer countries in a debt trap. What's your reaction to that?
Well, there's certainly an element of truth to that. We've seen the episode in Sri Lanka where China was handing out $1.5 billion loan to finance a new harbor in Sri Lanka. And when Sri Lanka defaulted on that loan, China took possession of that harbor and now has a harbor in Sri Lanka, which is part of their One Belt, One Road initiative, right in the middle of the Indian Ocean and right next to the local strategic rival, India. So there's an element of truth in that. However, Chinese loans are becoming a smaller and smaller share of the overall 60 billion handout that has, again, been promised for the next 3 years. Over the last 3 years, interest rate free loans and pure grants have just been about 5 billion of the 60 billion that have been invested by China in Africa. Now it's going to be 15 to 20 billion. On top of that, China has promised to invest more in sustainable projects that are, as you would say, high quality and not just vanity projects where local African governments are building a fancy new airport or harbor or anything like that, that is not economically viable. The Chinese government and Chinese lenders are becoming increasingly more discriminate about which kind of projects they are supporting.
Joachim, I hate to look at the whole of Africa as a monolith. It is, of course, an incredibly diverse continent. Which African countries, in your opinion, have benefited most out of Chinese investment?
So far, these were mostly the commodity exporting countries. The top 10 commodity exporters from Nigeria to South Africa to Uganda, etc., those were the ones who received most of Chinese foreign direct investments. By now, it is more and more also coastal countries that can provide help and infrastructure for the One Belt, One Road initiative. One classic example is the first overseas naval base of China was opened last year in Djibouti, actually in close proximity to an existing US naval base. And this Chinese naval base is not only a military and geostrategic base for China, but it, of course, supports Chinese efforts to help fight piracy in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Somalia, for example.
Okay, I'm afraid we are out of time. Fascinating discussion. Joachim Klement from Fidante Capital, thank you very much indeed.